I'm Mark Rhodes with New View Strategies. We originally presented this session at the User Group Summit North America 2020, and now we want to share our insights and experiences with you. Enjoy!
Hi there. Welcome to our session on designing dimensions to get powerful information. We're so pleased to be presenting at NavUG and BCUG Virtual Summit this year. I wanted to introduce you to somebody I brought along with me. I'm Carrie Peters, and my coworker that you can see in the slide is Carrie Carosa. She's going to be joining us in our session later today to talk about exactly how we use dimensions at New View Strategies and how we've applied things that we've learned about dimensions over the years to our own business. We hope that you enjoy the session and all the information that we have to share in this and other sessions related to all things finance with NAV and Business Central. If you have questions you'd like to ask us, feel free to reach out. Our emails are below. As we go through today's session, we're going to cover a checklist that's pretty simple. We're going to get you started with a homework assignment. We want to be sure that you have all the information you need to begin designing dimensions in the best way possible for your company. This homework is going to prepare you to have a discussion with the stakeholders in your company to make sure that everybody is happy with the result and excited to see what you're going to get out of your financial reporting as a result of using dimensions. I'll even give you a worksheet that you can use to figure out what your plan is and to use during your discussions. Your end result is going to be really incredible reporting that goes beyond basic financial reporting because you're using dimensions. So let's talk about this briefly. If you haven't seen this before, what is a dimension exactly? All a dimension is a data tag. That data tag is attached to a posted transaction that goes into your system, and that can be accessed when you're creating financial reporting. When we talk about designing dimension, though, we're talking about something else. We're talking about really making intentional and planned decisions about what it is that we want to see in our financial reporting. So ultimately, this decision about these little data tags that we're attaching in our system affects a big outcome with the information that we can see about how our company behaves financially. So here's your homework assignment. Before you talk with anybody, I need for you to stop and gather this information. You're going to need the chart of accounts, you'll need financial statements, and you'll need a budget. You'll notice that I say the current chart of accounts, financial statements, and budget. This is important because especially if you're in a new project, watch out for this. Here's the new chart of accounts. Here's the way we want our financial statements to be, right? That's future state. You have to understand the current state of how a company is talking about their financial information and what they're looking at with their financial statements before you can get too deep into these conversations about exactly what's happening with their financial progress. So take that current chart of accounts, take the future chart of accounts, same thing with the financial statements, but make sure that you understand how you're going to be able to fill the current requirements to make sure that we're gathering relevant data today, as well as being able to expand on that with information in the future. I have one other tip for you related to doing your homework. If you want to get a little extra credit on your homework, make sure you ask for the official or audited financial statements as well. It's not uncommon for companies to have a separate, more formal set of financial statements that they receive as a part of their audit progress. And we will often see a separate set of financial statements reviewed internally, which is often much more detailed. So start from the top with those official financial statements that have been audited, and make sure to include the actual reports that are used by management, which will probably be much more than just basic financial statements. So here are the things to look for when you're looking at the chart of accounts. As you go through the chart of accounts, watch for things like segmented accounts. If you see accounts that have a little dash between them, so they look like a little caterpillar of numbers, those are segmented accounts. For the most part, companies don't use those anymore. They've become an outdated concept, and we are able to replace segments with things like dimensions. The reason for that is that we gain a lot more flexibility when we're using something like dimensions instead of segments. We're also able to maintain a much smaller, shorter chart of accounts because we're only maintaining a natural GL account number instead of associated dimensions. Take a look at the overall number of accounts as well. If you have thousands and thousands of accounts, you definitely have too many. But even if you have a few hundred, I can guarantee you there's probably some room for cleanup. Chart of accounts usually erode over time. They become less and less organized as we use them more and more. So some evaluation, especially at a standpoint when you can choose to either implement a new system or re-implement where you have kind of a do-over, that's a great golden opportunity to take a chance to clean up the chart of accounts. And reducing the number of accounts overall is a great action to take. If you see obvious repetitive patterns, where you see a certain set of accounts being used for revenue, for cost of goods, for inventory, and they're all organized the same way, that's an example of an obvious repetitive pattern. And we're probably doing something like breaking down those accounts by a product line or a brand or maybe a customer or a region. Any of those kind of patterns that we see throughout, those are excellent candidates for attaching dimensions to that information. You're going to find a lot of easy wins that are on the income statement, especially when we think about things like departments and cost centers. If we apply that to what's happening with budgets and how we're tracking different kinds of expenses, you'll often see some repeating patterns related to departments and cost centers. And in particular, if you're looking at revenue and cost of goods sold, it's often an easy decision to be looking at things like product lines or brands. So watch for those easy wins that you can find on the income statement. So what about the financial statements? What kind of things are we watching out for here? This becomes a little bit less data-driven and more about storytelling. So when you sit down with the people at the company and you talk about their financial statements, what stories are they telling about their financial performance? What kind of language do they use? What kind of terminology do they use? And how do they focus on different concepts? Are they very customer focused? Are they very product or service focused? Or is it always about both? How exactly do they talk about margin? And in particular, let's move beyond the basic financial statements. Let's get beyond the balance sheet and the income statement, the statement of cash flows, and let's talk about what other reports are included. One of my favorite reports with my company is the Who Buys What report. That tells a lot about my company and what we're concerned with. So the other thing to watch for is look for things that are missing. Based on the things that you know about other companies, what do you see that's not there in their financial statements? A good example would be a company that I worked with recently who was completely focused on product and didn't have a single report that told them about their customers. And one of the topics during their meetings was a lot of questions about what's happening with the customers. So we worked with that company and we said, this is missing in your financial statements. And it sounds like you'd like to know more about it. Why don't we put a dimension in place that's going to categorize your customers so you can look at margin by customer as well as by product? And they were very happy with that. So the last thing to pay attention to with the financial statements is when they budget, what are they planning for? What are the measures that they're really focusing in on? Is it revenue only with forecast? Are they paying a lot of attention to margin? Are they only looking at trends related to their cost centers or departments? So as they budget, what kind of measures are they using in those budgets? So all of this information is really going to inform you about exactly what they might want out of dimensions. Your next step then is to sit down and have a discussion with the stakeholders about exactly what is happening with those things that you've looked at. So as you've examined the chart of accounts, these are some questions that you can ask them. What are the things about their chart of accounts that only they might know based on behavior? And understand what kind of problems they have as a result of the chart of accounts. How much complexity does their chart of accounts insert into their company, and how much time are they having to spend making corrections to accommodate for that? And then dig into the financial statements. Certainly have them tell you their stories. Talk about margin. Ask about the things that they've wanted to get that they couldn't get in the past because they didn't have the data. And certainly have that future reaching discussion to talk about what is it that they want to do that they can't do today because they don't have the data. Now, a point of administration with dimensions, you do have a few limitations with dimensions, but only a few. Truly, you have an unlimited number of dimensions, but we do have some limitations as far as having only 2 global dimensions and 8 shortcut dimensions. You have to pay attention to some of these guidelines as far as which dimensions are chosen in what order. And the best advice I can tell you is related to your global dimensions. Pick the 2 most important financial measures that the company has that they talk about all the time. Those 2 should be your global dimensions because they're easy to see in the system on any screen. Anything beyond that, we often have to do one additional thing. So some additional kind of assignment or filtering or another action to get to that information. So you want those 2 global dimensions to be the common things that they're looking at all the time. Here is your overall mission related to how we think about dimension. You absolutely must focus on finding out how to get dimensions populated by default. The reason for this is that we want to reduce the amount of data entry that is done in the system. We always want the system to do the work instead of our people doing the work. When the system does the work, we're going to have the benefit of less data entry, but also more accuracy. So absolutely take this away as the one principle you should think about with the dimension design. Get things to populate by default. And I'm going to provide you a worksheet that's going to help you to be able to get to these conclusions a little bit faster. And I'll spend some time explaining this to you. This is a view of that worksheet. We've got a worksheet available for download as well if you want to have one of these to work from. And each of these little sections can be defined for every single dimension. So let's talk about those little sections and what's included there. And once we talk through these definitions, then we're going to transition to a discussion with my coworker, Carrie, and I about how we define dimensions for our company. So briefly, what's on this worksheet? The first 2 things are just definitions. What is the dimension going to be called, and what are the values included there? As an example, if I have a dimension for region, my values might be north, south, east, and west. I always want to define whether that dimension is going to be populated by default, which I hope it will be, or if it needs to be populated manually. And I also want to say what is going to cause that dimension to be populated. If it's something that's populated by default, the thing that might cause the dimension to be populated is the creation of a sales order. So if I had a default dimension related to a customer, I could say when the sales order is created, the customer will be populated to the sales order. Okay, for an example, for a manual dimension, when the accounts payable invoice is entered, the clerk needs to enter the proper code for the department. Okay, understanding, especially for default dimensions, where that dimension comes from is important. It's always going to come from your master data, from your customer, your vendor, your item. So defining where that comes from so that we remember when we get further along in our process that when master data is set up, these dimensions must be included is part of the process. The last 2 things there are super important for our accounting folks to really truly understand what GL accounts are going to require that this information be provided. So those should be listed out specifically. Which accounts, which revenue accounts, what numbers are they, right? Which GL accounts are we going to put control on where we're going to say this dimension is required and we're going to say that that code is mandatory so that that always comes through without any population of blanks to your system. The very last thing is what reports are these going to come on? We don't want to be limited only to our balance sheet and our income statement anymore. There's so much more that we can do. And especially when we're using dimensions, we can expand the number of reports that we have. So I'll show you a quick view of what our dimensions were before. So this is an example of our worksheet. And if you want, you can stop the recording at this point and take a look at these. We actually made a change in our dimensions, and Carrie and I are going to talk about that in just a little bit. But I wanted you to see what this looks like when it's filled out. So this was our dimensions before. We actually had 9 of them. And this was our dimensions after. 2 global dimensions and 1 shortcut dimension. So let's go to our discussion with Carrie to talk about what our journey looked like and how we made changes with our dimensions. Hey everybody, I'd like you to meet my coworker, Carrie Carroza, or Carrie 2, as we like to call her. Hey Carrie.
Hi everyone.
So I wanted Carrie to join me today so we could talk about our journey with dimensions at our own company. Like lots of companies, we use Business Central now, but we didn't always use Business Central. We started using this software for our own company's business back in 2017 when it was Dynamics NAV. And we had picked a certain set of dimensions that at the time we thought was perfect. And Carrie, what did that look like? Do you remember what our dimensions were?
Yeah, I think we had probably about 9 dimensions total, maybe. Yeah, I remember that we had quite a long list of them. So it was definitely time for us to kind of reevaluate.
Yeah, no, and that's a good thought, right? That as we chose to re-implement to Business Central, because we had a very simple re-implementation to upgrade to the latest and greatest, but that was part of our process, is to do a little bit of cleanup. I remember we cleaned a little bit of our chart of accounts up and our posting groups and looked at dimensions all at the same time. But when we evaluated those dimensions, why did we feel like we needed fewer dimensions than what we started out with?
Yeah, so I remember I drove all the way down to Lakeville, Indiana, so Carrie and I could have a geek out brainstorming session on dimensions, which was actually pretty exciting. And we kind of looked at what's the reporting that we're doing now and how are the dimensions that we're using feeding into that reporting. So I think we kind of took each dimension that we had set up and we evaluated and said, where are we using this? Why are we using it? And are we reporting on it? Do we really need it?
Yeah, I remember that conversation. We even went through our old reporting package and we said, does anybody look at this page anymore? And we had a couple where we said, no, we don't even look at it anymore. So that was a good time to make some different decisions.
Yeah, I think some of our dimensions were a little bit easier to get rid of, but there were some that, we kind of went back and forth and said, well, do we need this? And maybe we don't, but then we remembered, oh, we're using it here. So we did have quite a bit of back and forth on actually, analyzing these dimensions and how we were using them.
Yeah, if I recall, it took at least a couple of conversations. And we talk with people about dimensions all the time. So, when you're talking about your own company and your own business decisions, sometimes you don't always get it right on the first time either. And I think one comment you made to me when we were talking about this session really rings true, that our business has just changed. Even in just 3 or 4 years, it's changed significantly to where some of those things weren't relevant for us anymore.
Yeah, I think at one point we probably were doing reporting and analysis on all of the dimensions, but when we looked at, what we're looking at big picture now, I think we just found that some of those just weren't relevant because, like you said, we have changed the way we do business, and with changing business, we need to reevaluate our dimensions.
Yep. I remember one of our dimensions that we had, I don't even remember what it was called anymore, but we had a dimension inside an existing listing, which is such a classic dimension problem that companies have.
And I know exactly what you're talking about. I think we had one of our globals is a service dimension. So what kind of service are we providing to our customers? And one of those services was training. And then within that training dimension, we further had another training dimension where we said, what type of training is it? So I think the way that we, kind of resolved this was we broke down that training dimension a little bit more on the service dimension so that everything was consolidated into one instead of having those different levels. Yeah, I remember that was always tricky for me for coding as well.
Right. Yeah, well, absolutely. Because we were like, well, what training service dimension is it? And then what training dimension is it? We absolutely overcomplicated our own schema as we were putting things together. So once we applied some thought to it, we said, okay, how can we make this super simple? And what do those labels mean to us, right? When we're coding an expense, right? What does that mean as far as how it applies to the GL account? But then also when it translates into the reports, what are we actually reporting on? And reporting on our service type was super important. So making those training, maybe 2 or 3 different labels instead of 8, made it blazingly clear what kind of services we were delivering.
Yeah, exactly. And I do remember another one too. We had quite the discussion on marketing. We had a general ledger account for marketing, but then we also had a dimension for marketing. So I think
Yeah.
we kind of went back and forth on, well, do we want the general ledger account or the dimension? And I think we ended up leaving the marketing dimension and getting rid of the GL account. But yeah, that was something too where it was kind of just making it more confusing because we
Right.
had that same label in multiple places.
Right. Yeah, and ultimately, I remember with that one too, we were tracking detail that was way more than was useful, right? We were trying to
Yeah.
break things down by what's work on our website and what's a print ad and what's a sponsorship and what are giveaways and all that stuff. We could evaluate other ways. We didn't really need to be looking at that financially. When we looked at financial reports, that level of analysis never really made it into that as important. And when we needed to look at it, which was really for budgeting once a year, we could get that better ways. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so you kind of touched on a point there too. I think we had a lot of discussion around, well, can we get this reporting from something else that we're already doing instead of doing the extra work of adding a dimension? And I think that was the case, for a few of the dimensions that we got rid of. So do you remember exactly how many dimensions we got rid of? I know it was quite a few.
Well, I know that today we've got 3 dimensions. So if we started at 8 or 9, gosh, we got rid of a majority when we reevaluated, didn't we?
That was very cleansing for me.
Me too.
And it has sure made my life a heck of a lot easier too, trying to go through and code things. And I know even in things like expense reports, it makes it a lot easier for our users to have to pick from, less categories when they're coding expenses. And I know that that's made it easier for everyone as well.
Yeah. No, I think the coding was definitely a big discussion because I always tell people when I talk about dimensions, how many times are you getting asked the question, how do I code this? And I was getting that at my own company, right? Where I was just like, oh gosh, why can't we figure out how to code this? And I would have the same question. I didn't even have it straight in my head because we made it too complicated. Yeah.
Yep. And that's exactly it. People would ask me and I'm like, well, shoot, I know I've been asked this question before and I've looked at it, but I don't even know. So yeah, I think that was definitely one major factor in, okay, we need to really look at this again and whittle down our dimensions.
Yeah. So I have to ask you, just out of a point of curiosity, when's the last time you had to make a journal entry to correct a dimension since we changed?
I don't think that I have actually.
Yay.
Yeah, I don't think I've had to reclass any dimension. So that is really exciting.
Yeah, that's good because I remember we had at least a couple of times last year before we transitioned to Business Central and changed all of our dimensions.
Yeah.
We had a couple of times where we sat down with stuff in the GL and said, gosh, this isn't in the right place. Let's reclass that. Let's do that. And both those things, people asking how to code things and needing to make correcting entries are symptoms that your dimensions just really aren't right.
Yeah,
So,
and I think you're right. We did a lot of that before, but I haven't found myself having to do that lately, which it's really nice too, because I hate making reclassing entries just to change a dimension.
right. Yeah. Annoying.
Yeah.
Yep. Very good. So, what about manual coding? So what do you do manual coding on now after we've made our change?
There's really not a whole lot. I know that we do have a couple accounts that have default dimensions on them. I think we have default dimensions on customers as well. And then even on purchase invoices or things like that, I have recurring purchase lines. So those have the dimensions assigned. So so I don't think that I very frequently have to pick dimensions. Now that you mention that, I haven't really thought about it because things are working correctly. So it's something that I haven't really consciously thought about.
Yeah, I love it. So theoretically, you should be able to set them up so that you only have to assign dimensions the first time. So if you have a new customer or a new item, assign them then, and then they carry through by default. And it is possible to get that set up so that you have no manual coding. And I always tell people that that's their mission. In fact, I'm sure I told them just a few minutes ago in this presentation that their mission, right, was to design everything to be populated by default dimensions.
Yep.
So, because it's just a huge time saver. You can gather so much cool data, but you don't want to increase your data entry burden.
Yeah, and I think even on journal entries, recurring journal entries, all the dimensions are there. So yeah, not only is it a time saver on the front end, but then you also eliminate your risk of coding something incorrectly and having to go back and do those reclassing entries like you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we talked about the past a little bit. Let's talk about the future, or really our now, right? So, what
Yeah.
is it that we're doing now that's successful? I know that we've got 3 dimensions, that we settled on 2 dimensions and one shortcut dimension, and that we're really super happy with those. So, maybe we can explain to people what those dimensions are and what it is that we like about them that's really working well for us.
Yeah, so I know one of our global dimensions is service. And for us, we are a customer service organization. So this is really important to us. And I think that's kind of what we do the most analysis on as well is our sales and how are our services broken down? What are we selling? What should we maybe be selling more of? So I think that was definitely important that we kept kind of that breakdown of sales and revenue, which is why we kept
Hmm.
a service dimension. I know
Yep.
we also have department on the expense side of things. So,
Hmm.
big picture, we're looking at revenue and expenses. And I think for us, it's just nice to know how those each are being broken down.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. And it does really keep the focus on the income statement, right?
Right.
We're not too concerned about, our cash needing to be tracked by different legal entities since we're a single company. So that keeps that simple for us. But really keeping that focused on the income statement with what's happening with our revenue and then what's happening in our expenses sure makes for easy analysis. I know that when you produce the financial reports that we have, I'm generally looking at a set of sales related reports and a
Right.
set of expense related reports. And, getting a chance to include our budgeted information with our expenses, right? How did we do against plan for our expenses? But even with our revenue, how are we doing against forecast? We can pull all of that information in because we're including those dimensions there as well.
Right. Yeah. And I think you'll probably be talking about this during your presentation, but I know we did decide to get rid of one of our global dimensions, which
Yeah, that's right.
was really interesting. So we had customer group
Yeah.
as a global dimension.
Yeah. Why did we get rid of that? Remind me.
I think we kind of decided that first, I think we had too many kind of dimensions that were unclear.
Hmm.
We weren't sure exactly how we classified those. And I
Yeah.
think that was, information that's changing on a regular basis as well. So maybe we had a nav user or Business Central user, but now so many people are implementing Business Central that I think the line for that was just kind of blurred as well. How do we classify things?
Yeah. No, true. That really wasn't clear, and I think that lack of clarity made that dimension not as useful. Right. The dimension that became useful that we actually ended up um, turning into a new global dimension was just customer. So
Right.
we don't have, a whole ton, we don't have hundreds of customers all at one time. So we were able to specifically identify those customers that we're currently working with the dimension so that we could look at exactly what services they're buying over time and understand their behavior with the type of services that we're using with them. So I thought that was extremely valuable when we started to look at the trends over time with what services our customers are taking advantage of. But the other thing that I really liked related to that change is that um, we were always able to answer the question of who was buying what in a very detailed way, but we could still choose to roll it up if we wanted. So every time that we look at our financial reports, my question always is well, what's going on with the customers, right? So it's great that we see everything rolled up in the revenue and that we're on trend and all that good stuff, but how can I get detail related to the customers? And I think that probably half of our financial statement package is different iterations of what's happening with the customers. What are they buying over time? What has their history been over a couple of years? All those different things. So we're really able to emphasize that, but also not lose sight of the services that we're delivering at the same time in that reporting.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, for most companies, sales is a really important figure. So having that reporting information on that is what a lot of probably management levels are going to want to see as well. So yeah, that was
Yep.
definitely something that was important for us as well as many other companies.
Yep. So one of the things that we had in the presentation was related to how we were dealing with default and manual. And we always say that all of our dimensions are populated by default, but our little worksheet says that it's manual, except that it's kind of by default. And what that's talking about is the import from Expensify. So can you talk a little bit about how we use Expensify along with NAV so that that acts like a default population?
Yeah, so, and actually we are on Business Central now, so I'll talk about how it works with Business
Thank
Central.
you. Good.
Yeah, it will work similarly with Microsoft Nav. So what I do each month is I just go into Expensify and I have a really nice export set up in Excel. And I've mirrored my columns so that they're exactly the same as my purchase invoice in Business Central. So I export this. I do just a really quick review, to see whether or not things are coded correctly. And I have noticed that ever since we made these dimension changes, I'm making a lot less manual changes to that Expensify report. So that used to take me a lot of time to post each month because we had, maybe hundreds of expenses and I had to double check the dimensions on all of these. So then all I do is just a simple copy and paste from that export into Business Central. So it's really not me adding any dimension information as far as department. It's just kind of a quick double check to make sure that that information is accurate. So yeah, it's kind of default in a way.
Right. No, that's great. All right. Well, good. Hopefully we've explained what our new dimensions are to the group and answered some questions a little bit about the journey of us reevaluating what those dimensions are and really ending up with something that we're happy with. What's your favorite thing about the changes that we've made with dimensions overall?
It just makes my life a heck of a lot easier. And I've also noticed that just less people are asking me questions. So,
Yeah.
that saves me a lot of time and having to look into things. So it's really nice having everyone in the company on the same page.
I love it. Very good. All right. So thanks very much, Carrie, for joining me for this discussion, everybody. I'm going to talk to you about a couple more things, and then we'll see Carrie back here in just a second to go through a little bit of Q&A about dimensions. So we'll see you in a minute, Carrie.
See you soon.
So that was a great discussion with Carrie 1 and Carrie 2 about what that journey looked like in a real world situation with our very own company. So we're very happy to share that with you. I want to bring your attention back to the checklist. If you are starting on this journey on your own, whether you are just designing dimensions for the very first time or whether you're revisiting your dimensions like Carrie and I did this year, here are the simple things that you need to do. Do your homework. Remember that involves pulling information about the chart of accounts and the financial reporting that exists already, including things like audited statements and budgets. Have the discussion with your stakeholders. It's always worth revisiting. People's needs change and companies' needs change. So nothing stays the same, and those reporting requirements are going to change along with that. Use the worksheet. The worksheet is going to guide you through all the information you need to gather for each and every single thing, and it's going to be a good reminder later when you might question why you made those decisions or when you need to explain it to somebody else. And then absolutely take this a step further and incorporate this into your financial reporting, whether it's with account schedules or some other reporting package. Having additional dimensions is going to give you a ton of extra flexibility, which is going to make you incredibly happy with that reporting. So let's go back to Carrie so that she and I can go through a little bit of Q&A with some common questions that people ask us related to dimensions.
So Carrie, that was an awesome session and I learned a ton. I do just have a couple of follow-up questions, and I think that some of the listeners might also have these questions. So my first one is, you talked about defaulting dimensions, and I know we talked about this as well when we talked about our dimension changes. Where exactly in the system can you default dimensions from? Are there limits to this?
Yeah, there are some guidelines that you have to operate in, and it's important to understand this to really be successful with completing your mission of using default dimensions, right? So really the first thing is that default dimensions should come from master data, and that really is going to be defined as your customer card, your vendor card, your item card. And those are attached to the primary card. So it's not coming from something supplementary. It's not coming from a ship to or a bill to. It's coming from the primary card. And whenever that card is utilized in the record, the dimension follows along with it into the document. So the other place that really you could have default dimensions is you could have that from the chart of accounts. I find that sometimes that's a little restrictive, and my preference is to put control on the chart of accounts with allowing a choice. So we could say for these accounts, I'm going to require that team is included as a dimension, but we don't say which value. and we accept that value coming from something else like default information from master data.
Awesome. Okay. So on that topic as well, what happens if I default a dimension on my item card and I also default that same dimension to something else on my customer card? How does that work with conflicting dimensions?
Yeah. So unfortunately, that is bad dimension design. So, and I don't see it too often, but I do see it sometimes. And I think it's generally a symptom of just not thinking things through. And I'll give you an example. So if I have a dimension that's area, which is north, south, east, and west, and I have that applied to my customer as master data, that kind of makes sense that we could have a customer in a certain region. But what if I also have that dimension for region applied to my items? Okay, so if I have a customer that is assigned to north and an item that's defined to south, when they are on a sales order, then what is the system going to choose? It creates a conflict. And the system does have a tiebreaker for that, but my point with this would really be don't put it in a position where there has to be a tiebreaker. If you really think that through, that region dimension really doesn't make sense for items. It makes a lot of sense for customers. So take that requirement off of the items and put it where it makes sense.
Perfect. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense, actually. Thank you.
Mhm.
So what happens if we decide that we don't need a dimension in our company? What happens if we change or we delete that dimension? Does that push through to historical data?
So you can't really delete a dimension. So if you have a dimension that has recorded transactions attached to it, the system isn't going to delete it. It truly is an extension of your general ledger account in that manner. You could choose to block it and discontinue using that. So that's one thing that you could do if you decide that you no longer want to gather that data. The other thing that you could do is you can just remove it from master data so it doesn't continue to push through the system. It just kind of fades away into the background. Changing dimensions can be a little bit more difficult. We did change a global dimension for what we needed to do, but we had a pretty small database, so that was very low risk for us. For other companies that have larger databases with millions of transactions, that can be a riskier proposition just because it can take the system a long time to do that. So trying that in a test system and understanding the consequences of changing a dimension are really important. So I always recommend that people work with somebody who's experienced with doing that before they just try that. The most important thing to look at is what are the consequences on your financial reporting, right? So what results are going to change in your history if you decide to change that? One of the best low risk things that you could do if you have a change like that is simply to add a dimension. So if you have some new requirements and you haven't gathered that information before, you could add a new dimension and put control behind that and start gathering that data. It'll only give you information on a go forward basis, but you can get a lot of good additional information just by choosing to add a dimension that you haven't had before.
Okay. What would happen if for some reason you have a dimension that you have not posted any transactions to? Can you delete it if you have no historical information?
You could, if
Okay.
there's no transactions posted against it, you can simply delete it. Correct.
Okay, cool.
Mhm.
And then my last question, I know we were chatting a little bit before about what we were looking at for reporting on dimensions. Are dimensions something that you can use on account schedules?
They sure are.
I know
So
you love account schedules.
I do. Account schedules are my favorite. And you and I get to talk about account schedules in another presentation for the summit. So I'm excited about that. Yes.
Hey.
But yeah, absolutely. Dimensions, in my opinion, are what make account schedules really sing. So account schedules by themselves without dimensions will accomplish basic financial reporting. So we can get things like our trial balance and our income statement and our balance sheet, but we really can't do a whole lot beyond that. When you start to apply dimensions, that's when we move into the range of managerial or operational reporting, where we can start to really answer the hard questions about what's happening with margin with our customers and with our products, and what's happening of performance for spend that we have on projects over time, or how our departments are doing in comparison with each other. We can even see what salespeople are making for those different customers and by those services. So it gets really exciting, and you can tell I get super excited about it because the kind of reports that we can build are really awesome once you incorporate dimensions. But the other thing that I really see a lot of people using more and more is they start using account schedules on a day-to-day to answer day-to-day questions. So you can go in there and research those things because you can drill down and see all of that detail real time with no delay in producing that in your system so that you can be proactive before your financial statements are even produced.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really good idea because most companies just would go in at month end and run the reports. So that's a really interesting take on that.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. I'd like to hear more about account schedule, so I'll probably be joining your account schedule session.
You
So I will.
absolutely will.
All right. Thank you so much for everything. I'll see you there.
All right. Thanks, Gary. Thank you very much for attending our session. We're so happy to share this information with you and to provide you with some real world examples of how we do things at NewView Strategies. We've got a free giveaway for you that I want to make sure that you know about. We have a shortcut cube that's available virtually this year, and you can see it looks something like this. And this is replacing our old foam cubes that we used to give away in our classes and at Summit. So we can't be there in person this year, so we want to be there virtually with our Shortcuts Cube. You can download this for free on the store on our website. So please download the cube and print it out on some colored paper. Give this to your employees. There are some great tips and tricks on here with things that you can do very quickly with keyboard shortcuts to help you be more efficient with your use of Dynamics NAV and Business Central. Enjoy the cube. Please complete your survey for our session. It was great to see you here.